Hi everyone, we're back with part 2 of how to turn your winging it panels into a book. So in part 1 we learnt how to put our panels together to make a page. If you haven't seen that video, I'll put a card in the top corner of the screen so that you can go back. So we trimmed down our panels and then stitched them together using one of our stitches of the month. And then we made a little January tab to put on the side. So then in week 5 of January we did our skills panel, and I deliberately worked on a bigger scale because I wanted it to back my January pages. If you worked on a smaller scale, you might want to save all your technique pages and put them together as a page towards the end of your book. It's really up to you how you make use of those panels and how you want to build your book. So what I'm going to show you today is how to put these two panels together to make a back-to-back page. So there's lots of ways that you could do this. If you wanted to keep each page separate, you could just put a piece of fabric or a panel of felt on the back of each page. But I've deliberately arranged my pages because I want them back to back. So I've just given away my first tip, which I've already done. But on the back, I've made a little tab for my applique page. And I want it to line up with the January tab. So what I did was make another tab in exactly the same way as the tab that I made for January. And I haven't stitched it to the page, I've stitched it to the tab. So if I bring it up to the camera, you should be able to see some little running stitches around the edge there. So that means that whatever happens as I'm attaching the applique page to the back, the tabs are always lined up. So that's already in place. I thought I wouldn't show you how to do that again because the instructions are already in that first video. So it's not actually attached to the page, it's attached just to the tab. And the other thing that I did to prepare was I trimmed back my applique panel to fit, and I did that by just laying my January panel on top and cutting back the edges so that they met up. So now we've got to attach them together, and the first thing I'm going to do is line up these two panels and make sure they're really precisely lined up. And I'm going to pin it in place, but I'm going to be really careful as I do this not to damage any of the stitching on any of my panels. So I'm just going to put one pin in for the same reason as last time. If I put too many pins, because there is quite a lot of layers here now, it's just going to distort and make it difficult to sew them together accurately. So I'm just feeling on the back to make sure I'm not going through anything important, and just sort of making sure those edges are neat. Now I'm going to use blanket stitch to sew my panels together. I wanted to wait for this video until we'd learnt blanket stitch, and if you aren't sure, I'll put another card in the top corner because blanket stitch is covered in our March stitch tutorial video. Now in that video we did blanket stitch on a flat surface. Now this time we're going to be going over an edge, and although the stitch is formed in essentially the same way, there are a couple of tricks to make sure you get a neat finish all the way around. So I'm going to start off actually in between my panels. So I'm just going to peel back that top layer, and that's my 2 strands of embroidery thread, and I've just put a knot in the end. And I'm going to go through from in between the panels through to the back. So I've just peeled back that top layer and I'm pulling my thread all the way through, and that will catch the knot in between the layers and keep it out of the way for when we're stitching. So now I'm just going to line up my needle on the front panel with where I can see that thread's come out. I'm not going to go all the way to the back, but I'm just going to go through the front layer and up again through the middle. So we've sort of looped our thread over the edge, and the stitch starts and ends in between the two panels. And I want my thread to come up to the left of that bar. So when I pull my thread tight, that bar catches it and holds it in place, ready for us to start stitching. Now if you're right-handed, we're going to be working left to right, but if you're left-handed, you'll want that thread on the other side because you'll be working right to left. So I'm keeping my thread out of the way, and I'm going to form my blanket stitches in exactly the same way. So I'm going to go along a little bit, and I'm going to make sure my needle goes straight through the fabric rather than at an angle, because we've got to remember that both sides of this are going to be visible. So I want to make sure my stitches are even on the back and the front, so we're just going to have to keep our eye on the back. And I'm going to push my needle through, make sure it comes up inside the loop. Look, I've got a knot straight away, that's because my thread's too long. So these are noose knots, they're not actually knots, and if you just put your needle through the loop and pull up on the loop whilst pulling gently down on the working threads, the knot should release itself. So I'm going to go along a little bit, and again check on the back. You will get your eye in after a while, so you won't have to keep checking in exactly the same way, and pull my thread through. It really is better to work with shorter lengths of thread. My thread is far too long here. So again, I'm going to keep my stitches even. I don't want to pull too tight because I don't want to pucker the edge or affect the pile of the felt. So needle straight back and pull through. So I'm going to show you in a minute how to deal with those corners, but I'm just going to work my blanket stitches along the edge to the corner, just making sure the back and the front looks even and my stitches are evenly spaced all the way along. So now we're at the corner, and I want to make sure my corner looks really neat. So we're going to make a trio of stitches across that corner. So I'm looking at the spacing of my stitches here, and I've stopped one stitch space away from the edge. And what I'm going to do is just use my needle to poke in any little bits that are sticking out and make sure my corners are nice and square together. Now I'm going to take my needle diagonally down from the corner and back in at the base of that last stitch. So we're thinking about our square, and we're going to work around a square that fits into the corner, and my corner stitch is going to be diagonally across the corner, so you can line it up with your needle if you want to, just to make sure you're getting your angle right. And I'm pushing my needle back down the same hole that the last stitch was formed in, and I'm going directly through to the back, and again I'm checking the spacing. And if you pull your thread in the direction you want your stitch to sit, it will naturally go there. You might need to do a little bit of manipulation with your needle just to make sure it's really precisely on the corner, just because we've got several layers of felt here and you just want your stitch to sit exactly right. So I've got my triangle in the corner, and then we're going to make another stitch through that same hole again. So I'm taking my needle squarely through, and this time I'm going to form the first stitch on my new side. So again, I'm pulling the thread vertically this time so that the stitch forms along that second edge, and there I've got my neat corner. And if I bring it up to the camera, you should be able to see I've got that little sort of fan around the corner, and it will keep your corners really neat and sharp. So now I'm going to just carry on along the next edge as though nothing happened. So again, just checking that my stitches are even on the back and the front, and working my way along So I've nearly run out of thread, and I want to leave myself enough thread to finish it off neatly. So I thought I'd just show you how to do that. So I'm going to make one more stitch, and I'm going to take my needle back through that loop just as if I was making a normal blanket stitch, but rather than moving on, I'm going to go back through that stitch that I've just made. So I'm just taking my needle underneath that loop and back through the loop again. So I've made a new little loop, and I'm taking my needle back through again and then pulling it tight, and I think I'll just do it once more just to make it really secure. And then I'm going to hide my thread end. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to open up my 2 panels, and I'm going to take my needle out through a safe place a little bit away from my edge, and then I'm going to pull my thread tight and push down on my scissors as I snip that thread. And because the thread is under tension, the end will just bounce back into the felt and you won't be able to see it. Now that does 2 things. First of all, it keeps your threads, your stitching on the edge really neat, but it also keeps that thread end away from the edge so that it's going to be completely invisible. So now I've got a new thread, I've knotted the end, and I'm opening up my panels again, and I'm just catching some of the fibres of the felt. So I'm not taking my needle all the way through, but I'm just taking it through the top fibres of the felt. And what I'm going to try and do is hold my knot and my thread end away from the edge so that I get a completely invisible join. So now I'm going to bring my needle up to the left of that last stitch where I finish off my thread and pull it through. And so now my thread is positioned for me to just carry on stitching as though nothing happened, and you're going to get a completely invisible join there with no bulk at the edge getting in the way of your stitching, because all the knots are kept well away from that edging. So you can see that join is invisible there. You'd never know that we just started a new thread. Okay, so I've just made my corner in the usual way, and I thought I'd just stop and show you how to deal with that tab. So the problem with blanket stitch is that our horizontals are going to have to be on either one side or the other. So I'm just making sure my tab is aligned correctly, and I'm just again going to put a pin in to hold it in place. And we talked about this in the last video, but I don't want too many pins. I've got to be really careful that it doesn't cause distortion in the felt. So what I'm going to do is stitch through all the layers. So I've got 2 tabs and 2 book pages here, so there's quite a lot to stitch through, and I'm going to keep all my horizontals on the front of the tab. We'll worry about the back shortly. You might need to just fiddle about with the tab. I should say that with my applique tab, I did a little bit of applique on that tab because I want my tabs to reflect what we were doing in the month. So January was just straight stitch, so that's just a back stitch that I've used there, and applique I've added some layers of fabric just so that it reflects what's on the page. So I'm going to work through all the layers. So I'm going to take my needle all the way to the back through all the layers there, and then I'm just going to come back through, just checking it's lined up. I'm going to come back through right at the edge of that applique page, 1 stitch length apart, and so the loop of my blanket stitch is on the front, and that's where I catch it. And I'm going to keep all my stitches on the front like that. So down through all the layers, making sure my needle is coming out where I want it to, and then back through just the tab, so right at the edge of the pages, through the loop on the front, and there's my blanket stitch. And you just work your way along the tab in that way, just keeping all those horizontals, keeping the loops of your working thread to the front, to the January side of your tab. And you may well need to just keep readjusting your tab as you go to make sure it's straight. Don't take for granted that it's going to be okay. So now I'm just at the end of my tab, and the camera's flattening the image so it looks a little bit wobbly, but it is actually quite neatly lined up when you see it in 3 dimensions. But you can do a little bit of fiddling about with your needle just to straighten those up and make it really neat. So we've got our problem on the back because we've now just got vertical stitches with no horizontals. Now you could leave it like that, but I quite like the finish to be the same on the back, and so we're going to artificially put in the horizontals. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my needle underneath that first stitch and pull it through, and then I'm going to go back over the stitch and under it again, but this time I'm going to go under the next stitch as well. And then I'm going to go back over that second stitch and take my needle under it and under the third stitch. So I'm sort of doing a back stitch, but rather than going through the fabric, I'm going just through those vertical stitches that we've put in. And I'm just going to work my way all the way along like that. And when we get to the end, I'm just going to finish off my thread in the usual way. So make a loop, sew through it, make a loop again, and then take my needle back through in between the layers of felt and bring it up just somewhere safe that isn't going to damage any stitching. And then we pull the thread tight, push down on our scissors as we snip, and the end will just disappear back into the felt. So you should be able to see there that I've got a sort of faux blanket stitch on the back that will make it look pretty seamless, whichever side you're looking at. So I'm going to sew the rest of the way around, and then I'll show you how to finish it off so that your start and end point is seamless as well. So I'm almost back to the beginning now, and I've stopped about a stitch length away from my starting point. I might just put one more in there because it's just slightly too big. So that's my last stitch now, and what we're going to do is join up our last stitch with our first. So what I'm going to do is take my needle underneath that first stitch where we made that bar over the edge of the page. So my needle is going to go through that stitch and back over the top, and that adds in that missing horizontal that from the last stitch to the first. So now I'm just going to finish off my thread in the usual way and take my needle in between the pages, bring it out somewhere safe that isn't going to affect my stitching, and snip the end, and that thread end will disappear back inside the page. So that is how to put your pages back to back. We've got a really neat finish all the way around, and our pages are held together really neatly. So in part 3, I'm going to show you how to join together multiple back-to-back pages. So I hope you'll join me then. Can't wait to see your January pages all put together. I hope that's been helpful. I will see you again for part 3. Bye.